Okay, yes. So good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're super excited for this first session of our Lenten Forum series called Uneven Ground, a Call for Economic Justice. As David said, today and for the following 3 Sundays, we'll grapple with economic injustice both broadly and close to home. We'll seek to understand the lived realities across socioeconomic backgrounds, and we'll contemplate together what a faithful response might look like, spiritually, relationally, and systemically. We've called today's topic the billion-dollar problem, and we're utterly delighted to welcome our very special guest joining us via Zoom from Berlin, Dr. Ingrid Robeyns. Dr. Robeyns is a Belgian-Dutch philosopher and economist focused on social justice and inequality. She works as a professor at the Ethics Institute of Utrecht University in the Netherlands, where she holds the chair in ethics of institutions. Dr. Robeyns has gained popular attention internationally for her 2024 book, Limitarianism, The Case Against Extreme Wealth. Dr. Robeyns pioneered the concept of limitarianism, which she defines as the moral and political position that no individual should be allowed to possess extreme personal wealth. Her book is being translated into 12 languages and has sparked debates worldwide about wealth distribution and social responsibility. Thomas Piketty, the French economist and preeminent scholar on wealth and income inequality, called her book Limitarianism a must-read. So we must discuss. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, Dr. Robeyns. I will start the conversation by posing a few questions to you, and then in about a half hour or so, we'll turn to take questions from the audience. Dr. Robeyns, could you please start by giving our audience a brief overview of the problem that your book addresses?
Yes, good morning to all of you. It's good afternoon here in Berlin, but I'm delighted to be able to join you across the Atlantic without actually having to physically move to the US, which I actually am no longer doing until you have a change in government, because I don't think it's safe. But putting that aside, I would like to start this conversation this morning by showing you some very basic facts on wealth inequality. So I am not, if I look at the big screen, I don't think the slides are up, but I think it would help to just show a few figures before we go to the moral reasoning. Yes, thanks very much, Sharon. So this is just background information to the conversation we will be having afterwards. And in case you already know these facts, please bear with me for a couple of minutes. And I will try to summarize the data so that you don't have to look at all the figures. But the first slide, and I only have 4 slides, so it won't take too long. The first slide is about average wealth, comparing the US with other countries. And basically what we see here is that the US is much richer than other continents or other countries. So you see that this is from the World Inequality Lab, which is a lab that Thomas Piketty founded in Paris. And these data are publicly available, so you can check them for yourselves. The US has average individual wealth of around almost $400,000. These dollars are what economists call purchasing power parity. That is, they've been put on the same level of what you can buy with a dollar in a particular country. So price differences are taken into account for these data in order to make them as comparable as possible. Europe is still much richer than the average in the world. Namely, the average in the world is around $120,000. Europe is close to $300,000. But we see that the US really is remarkably richer than other continents or other countries. And of course, if we then go to at the bottom of the table, Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa, just as examples, we see that their average wealth is much lower. But these are averages. And what I want to talk to you about is really the inequality. So if we can go to the next slide. Basically, here I'm looking at the distribution of wealth in the US and Europe. So let's first only look at the US. The bottom half of the population in the US has 2.3% of all wealth. So that's almost nothing. I mean, in Europe, it's not much better. It's actually worse. It's 1.6%. But then I should say that the public provisions are different. So this cannot be compared one-on-one. But what we see is that half of the population, both in Europe and in the US, have almost nothing of the wealth. Then we have a middle part of the next 40% that has at least some amount of wealth. In the US, it's 24%. But what we really see, and let's now first only look at the US, is that the richest 10% have the vast majority of all wealth. The richest 10% in the US has 73.5% of all wealth. And the more we zoom in to the top 5%, that's 5 out of every 100 citizens, they have 61% of wealth, and the top 1% has 34% of wealth. So if you take 100 American citizens, then one of them has 1/3 of the wealth. One of them has 1/3 of the wealth of that group. And in in Europe, the distribution is slightly less unequal, but also still very unequal. I mean, so basically what the data show us is that there's sometimes disagreement about which is the most unequal country in the world. I mean, Russia is a candidate. Sometimes people say Brazil, South Africa. It depends on which data you look exactly at. But what we definitely know is that the US is the wealthiest and also highly unequal, one of the most unequal. And if we can then go to the next slide, I will zoom in on the very, very top. And that is the billionaires. This again is public data. This is the Forbes real-time billionaire list from a few days ago. And what we here see is that Elon Musk had earlier this week almost $850 billion. Now, to most of our brains, except if you are a financial expert, these numbers mean nothing. So what's important to realize is that $850 billion is 850 thousand, and then you have to make it multiply it with 1,000 to get to millions, and then you have to try to imagine something that's worth $1 million. So imagine a nice house of $1 million. Then we can see that Elon Musk has the equivalent of 846,000 of those houses. And what is also important to realize is that number has gone up dramatically. When I started to give talks, when my book came out 2 years ago, this number was around 270 billion, and now it's already at 846, which has a lot to do with how the value of his companies is changing. What do we know about billionaires in the world? There are right now around 3,030 billionaires. These numbers should be taken with a grain of salt because we do not know of all. I mean, the more money somebody has, definitely if somebody has hundreds of millions or billions, the bigger the opportunities to hide the wealth, for example, in tax havens. But what we do know is that the US has the largest numbers of billionaires, but also countries such as China and India have a large number. But then we have to, of course, take into account that these are countries that have more than 1 billion inhabitants, which is not the case for the US. And then next is Europe, which has a number of countries which have billionaires. What we also see when we look at the data on billionaires is that their numbers go up year after year after year, and also their average wealth is going up much faster than the wealth of ordinary citizens. So if you think about how much do you get on your savings account, I think my savings account probably has like somewhere between 1% and 2% interest. But the billionaires, they have returns of up to 10% or more. On average, a billionaire in the last year had 5.2 billion, and that was $2 million more than a year before. So what we see from those data is that at the very top, the problem of concentration is growing and is growing fast. And then I'll take you to the last slide, which is trying to give you one explanation for why this has happened. This has happened due to a range of reasons. One has to do with technological changes, which has led to a market of products that allow entrepreneurs to have very large profit margins. But here we see something also very important. This comes from one of the books of Thomas Piketty, and this is the effective tax rates in the US between 1910 and 2020. The effective tax rates is if you combine all the different taxes and you calculate what the tax on the income of different groups in society is. And what we see is that between, say, 1920, when we started to have higher tax rates, and somewhere around 1970, there was a clear difference between what the least rich, 90%, so basically the vast majority of the population would pay in terms of tax rates, and what the richest would pay. And that when there is a difference, when the richest pay more taxes than the others, so basically the richer you are, the more the percentage of tax you pay, that's what's called progressive taxation. And what is happening today is that we see that actually it doesn't matter how rich you are, everybody pays roughly the same effective tax rates. And it's actually the case, and this comes from research from Gabriel Zuckman, that the billionaires in the US pay less taxes than other groups because they have such a machinery at their disposal of tax evasion that other groups do not have. So taxes are really a crucial part of the conversation in how the very rich have become so very rich. So this is just by way of background of setting the scene, and now we can go into the moral discussion, which I, as a philosopher, have tried to contribute to.
That's great. Thank you very much for giving us an overview of just the magnitude of this inequality problem. So your book explains many different ways in which the current levels of inequality, both in the US and worldwide, are extremely harmful to individuals' mental and physical health, to social cohesion, to democracy, to our planet's health. Can you please outline those arguments for us?
Yes, I think so. The main thing that I've been doing in my research is to flip the coin when we think about what the wealth means. And I should say straight from the start, wealth is very important. It's important for everybody. And it's also, in that sense, it's also different from income, because income is normally used for your basic provisioning to buy groceries, to pay bills, to pay the rent, or to pay the mortgage. But if you're able to accumulate some wealth, either save it or it's inherited or in another way, it gives an additional degree of freedom. It gives peace of mind in case there is a setback. It gives the possibility to set up a business. It gives the possibility to let your children study if there is a degree that is expensive. So wealth opens up a degree of freedom and power that income doesn't have. So that is why I'm concentrating on wealth. And I think actually my slogan would be, it's good that everybody has wealth, but then also everybody and nobody too much. Why this thing, nobody too much? The reason here is that we see that if wealth concentrates, so when we're talking about the centimillionaires and the billionaires, there's a number of harms that this wealth can do to groups and the planet. So the first one is democracy. There's empirical research that shows that that wealth concentration undermines the principle of political equality. I mean, political equality, think of the principle one person, one vote, but also that everybody has an equal opportunity to influence policy. And we see that policymakers or governments are much more inclined to respond to the wishes of those who are much richer. Now, how is that the case? Well, there's all sorts of mechanisms that come from research. One is lobbying. It's not difficult to understand that if one is rich, one has money to lobby for one's interests. So we also see that those who are rich or their enterprises are able and are putting in much more money to lobby. A good example of very bad effects this has had is in the fossil fuel lobby, which has really spent enormous amounts to try to hold the transition to a low carbon economy. So that's lobbying is an important one, but there's also direct donations to politicians. Here we see very big differences between countries. So, for example, in the country where I live, in the Netherlands, until recently there was a cap to how much one could donate to a political party or to an individual of 1 million euros per person per year. And then we had a case where somebody, so we have a lot of parties. We have like, I don't know, 7 or 8 parties, but one of them, the bigger ones, is the Christian Democratic Party. They are like center-right. And a businessman had donated 1 million euros to this party. And immediately afterwards, the party submitted a proposal for a change in the law so that if you inherit a business, you are exempted, or you have a very large exemption for inheritance taxation. So that, and then this connection was so obvious that all political parties, except our most extreme right-wing party, voted for a lowering of the cap to 100,000 euros. And that has an effect. If you can only, I mean, of course, for ordinary people, 100,000 euros is a lot of money. But if you have 100 million, you would rather want to spend some millions on campaign donations rather than just a little bit. And I think this effect has really become very obvious in the last American presidential elections in the behavior of a number of billionaires, but especially, I think, Elon Musk, who donated the highest amount that has ever been donated to a presidential candidate. And then what we saw was that Musk gained a role in the executive, namely with the Department of Doge that he just invented, and went on to do what he saw as what he wanted to do. And there is a clear connection between his donations to President Trump and the fact that he was then just allowed to do what he wanted. So basically, you buy yourself a way into politics. So that's an important other, so basically it's what I mentioned, it's lobbying, it's donations. And the third one is the public sphere, the media. If media are an important part of democracy, because in the media we have conversations with each other. We talk about what we find important, what the problems are that we think need to be solved, how we see the facts. And here again, there are some very disturbing developments happening. I think Rupert Murdoch is always used as an example in the academic literature of somebody who used his fortune to gain power in the public sphere. And right now, of course, with the concentration of media companies, but with the buy-up of or the offer made to Warner Bros. Is another example of where you see that too many mainstream and highly influential media companies are under the ownership of one particular billionaire. So this is a reason why some scholars argue that we should have much better protected media for the sake of democracy. I've only mentioned democracy and I've been going on, but so I'll just mention the other factors. And each of those factors has a chapter in my book. So I fear I will have to be brief, but extreme wealth concentration is also incompatible with our climate obligations. We see that both the consumption patterns, but also the investment patterns of centimillionaires and billionaires are incompatible with what is needed for climate mitigation and adaptation. We also know from some earlier research that if inequality becomes too big, it has an effect on social cohesion. It's also the case that we saw in the last of the 4 graphs of the 4 slides that I showed that the tax has become much less progressive. One of the things we've also seen from the data is that private wealth has increased, but public wealth, so the wealth that the government has decreased. The governments have, since the 70s, privatized a number of their functions, of their organizations, but also its capacity to raise taxes has decreased because it has constantly lowered the taxes on the richest. And hence, this also means that if you give a tax cut to the richest, that means you have less money that you can use for example, poverty alleviation programs. So there is a very interesting book written by the Princeton sociologist Matthew Desmond, who argues that poverty is actually by design. And that is very important. And I think we can make the same argument for global inequality and global poverty, because some of the data I present in my book show that from the collective production that we do by globalized trade chains, we actually give only breadcrumbs to workers in the global south, and the companies in the global north take the lion's share. So that means that if we had a different division of those revenues, there would be less poverty. So I think these are a number of important reasons. There are many more reasons. I mean, there are also scholars who've written books that came out after my book was written, who argue that wealth inequality is actually going to destabilize societies. There is Guido Alfani, an Italian economic historian, who has looked at what explains why the very richest are tolerated in society, why this inequality is accepted. And he says it is because when there is a crisis, we call upon the very richest to come and help society. So think of the medieval pest or some other disaster. And his conclusion is that the richest are no longer willing to play that role to be the saviors in case of disaster. And that means that he thinks they're undermining the reasons that we have to accept that there are some groups that are rich. And the recent book by the Cambridge scholar Luke Kemp, who has written about how civilizations can actually decline and just vanish, also is very pessimistic about the relationship between the current rise in wealth inequality and the survival of the species. He just thinks that this is incompatible, and that the only way to really safeguard humanity's future on the planet is by reducing inequality and going for a much deeper democratization of how we run our societies. So these are just some of the reasons why I think there are harms to wealth inequality and to extreme wealth concentration, and why we should take this seriously.
That's great. That's great. And I noticed you are not saying that all wealth is bad by any stretch. You said that, you know, it's really beneficial. Everybody needs to have a level of wealth to have basically peace of mind and choices in life and things like that, to be able to thrive, not just survive. At the same time, your book makes a very compelling argument that no one deserves to have like tens of millions of dollars or more in wealth. Many in St. John's audience are very well educated individuals who become relatively wealthy thanks to a combination of surplus income that they've been able to invest and perhaps inherited assets. Most also give very generously to our church and other social causes. But your book says a lot to those who feel they deserve the great wealth that they've accumulated. So I'm wondering what you might say to us who feel that we need a substantial nest egg as a safety net for ourselves and for our family amidst the rising economic uncertainty.
Yes, so the question about insecurity is definitely a very real one. And this is also why I think the question, how much do we need, is one that will be different in different countries. So I'll give you one example. In the Netherlands, there is a universal basic pension. Everybody who has lived in the Netherlands between the ages of 15 and 65, or a proportion of this, is entitled to a basic pension at the level of the poverty line. And this also explains why the Netherlands has one of the lowest incidences of poverty among the elderly. But of course, that comes with a cost. You have to raise the taxes to make sure that everybody has a basic pension. But that means that if you have a public or a semi-public healthcare system and you have something like a basic pension, you have a certain type of security that you don't have if both your healthcare system and your pension are completely an individual responsibility. So I'm currently affiliated at the a Free University in Berlin, and I spoke to a woman the other day who had been working for an American firm for her. She's now retired, and she was talking about my book. She had read my book, and she said, "But don't you think?" Because in the book I say that based on research we did in the Netherlands, that in the Netherlands, if you have 1 million, actually you have more than enough. But that is because of the pension and the healthcare system. And then she said, but 1 million, my house is worth 1 million and then I have no saving, I have no pension. And that's why I think it depends on the context. So it may well be, and it's very likely that in the US, you actually need more if you, or you have to take your, depends on whether your saving is part of your wealth or not. But I think the fundamental question is, how much do we need? And there is we don't need endless amounts of money. And at what point does wealth concentration start to harm society? These are two different questions. The second one is a really political question, and the first one is a question about individual ethics and morality. So so I definitely totally understand that people need to make sure that they are secure also in old age when they become ill, or they may have a disabled child, or there may be all sorts of circumstances why one needs more money than somebody else. But the question about deservingness is a very interesting one, and I should say also a very philosophical one, because in daily language we use the term desert. I deserve. I don't know what. Something that because I worked hard, I deserve this income. But actually, philosophically speaking, there are two different notions. There is entitlement, which is a legal concept, which means I have a contract with my employer. If I do my job well, the employer has to pay me my wage, and hence I'm entitled to the wage. But deservingness, moral deservingness is a philosophical notion. And this really is the answer to the question, is what I claim that I deserve, can I really say that I as a person really took the decisions or had the agency to create that result? And are the kind of public narrative or the culture we've had since the 70s put a lot of emphasis on personal responsibility. Both if you fail, you must have done something wrong, but also if you become very successful, you did something very good. But what we see from the social sciences and psychology and so forth is that luck plays such an important role in our lives. And I describe this in detail in the book, but just to sum it up very briefly, first of all, there is what John Rawls called natural luck. The genes you have, your innate talents, they're completely a matter of luck because we didn't create ourselves. So that means that if you are, for example, very smart or you're very talented, that is, you should actually be grateful rather than say, hey, look at what I did. Then there is social luck, which is the social class in which you grow up. There's increasing research that shows that the first 1,000 days in a person's life have a very great explanatory power to explain how people then fare in their lives. That the first 1,000 days in your life, you're a baby and a toddler. You can't be held responsible for how things are going then. And then there is another type of luck, which is, another part of the social luck is the social class you grow up in. People who grow up in poor neighborhoods have very different opportunities in life than people who grow up wealthy. And then finally, there's even such a thing as market luck, which means that you can have two people who are equally qualified who apply for the same job, and one will get it and the other won't get it. And that there is a lot of randomness involved in who gets it and who doesn't. Randomness is a form of luck, and the same with products. So that means if you take all of that into account, I still think we can say if we did something good, if we're doing our jobs well, if we are caring for our communities, for our families, if we, whatever we do, I still think we are really, we should really feel proud for what we do. And we can take some of the credits and hence we can say that we deserve some of it. But currently, the division in stakes, so the division in who gets what, if you are the one who gets to reap the revenues at the top, is so big, and it is also increased so dramatically that we can no longer say that, say, a CEO deserves a wage of, let's say, 30 million or 50 million or whatever. That is just basically a game that has developed where people start to compare themselves with each other. But you can no longer say that this is really a matter of deservingness, how philosophers understand it. Now, I should say I understand that this is really flipping how we see ourselves. So this view that I construct based on what I get from empirical knowledge from the social sciences and psychology and economics really flips the self-understanding that our dominant culture teaches us. Because we're constantly told, oh yes, we did well, so we deserve our wages or our fortune or whatever. And if you end up in bad luck, if you end up in poverty, you did something wrong. And basically, I think we should be much more accepting that there's to a large extent it's a matter of luck, and if that is true, and if we accept that, then the consequence is that we do still think there's a justification for some inequality, but only some inequality, and not the levels we currently see. So that's the argument of desert for limitarianism and for reducing inequality.
Okay, that's, yes, very powerful. So we've been using the word limitarianism. I guess we haven't defined it exactly. I gave a brief definition, but do you want to talk a little bit more about limitarian and and more importantly, what it could look like in practice?
Yes, so limitarianism is the view that that one can have too much wealth. And then I've already given the reasons. It is because it can be harmful for society, which is the political reason, or it is because you don't need it as a person. And so basically I argue for, and that means that if you argue for limitarianism, you argue for a certain cap. At some point, it's enough. And then the question is, what kind of limit would this be? And I distinguish between two different versions. One is a political limit, which is, I think we should try to organize societies in such a way that everybody can flourish. That's the most important. And that we, of course, there's other things we want. We want to keep the planet safe for future generations and so forth. But everybody should flourish. But at some point, wealth concentration should be eliminated, or we should limit wealth inequality, and that is a political cap. And the question, where should we put that political cap, depends on where those harms kick in. And I should say in the book, I say, okay, I'm guessing this should be at 10 million, but I do not know. I also say in the book, I'm saying this for the sake of debate. And this is the answer to this question is currently being investigated by a new research project by colleagues from the London School of Economics, together with the Patriotic Millionaires, the New Economics Foundation, and Oxfam. And we're trying to really find the empirical knowledge of where those harms kick in or where they become very large. And then we will have better information on when wealth becomes too much from the point of view of society. So that's the political limit. And then there's also an ethical version of limitarianism, which is the question that we can each ask ourselves: when do we have too much? And of course, there will be people who will not have too much. Many people will not have too much, but there are also people who could ask themselves this question. So it is both an ethical, personal call, appeal, and also, I think, a political project.
Great. So I'm mindful of the time. I really want to have you address what we in the room can do about this problem, because it's big problems require big solutions, government action, that sort of thing. Some of us, are in the federal government, but, still we're basically all ordinary citizens. I don't know, can you take a couple minutes for that, and then we'll turn to the audience because I do want to get their questions. I'm sure they have a lot. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry I've been talking too long, but I will be very brief on the question what we can do. Because I really think this will require a big change. I really think we have we have basically given too much power both to governments but also to the economy. So it's basically to this the economic system, and the only way to regain the power as citizens is that we all become active as citizens, and that's not just voluntary work. Voluntary work and charity is important to alleviate particular needs, but it is also really to make the countervailing powers that are needed in a democracy. So what I always, because I always get this question when I give talks in Europe, I always get the question, what should we do? And what I say in Europe is, if you live in a country which has multiple political parties and there are several or that are decent, join a political party. Of course, I will not say anything about the US because I am not in a position to say whether you have decent political parties, but I do think it is important not to leave politics to a separate group, an elite. We should become politically engaged. That's possible by joining political parties, by becoming active in unions. One of the explanations actually for wealth inequality has also been the deunionization. And we see, for example, that a company such as the companies from Elon Musk are aggressively anti-union. Unions have been the group that has been that has been historically responsible for making sure that the division between those who have the capital and those who have the labor has been fair, and that has changed. But you could also join a human rights group or a group that helps refugees. And I understand from the information we get in Europe about what's happening in the US that this is at present, I would say, difficult, or it requires, I think, extraordinary courage in some circumstances. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is that we will just basically completely slide to authoritarian regimes. And one of the things we see is that over the world, the number of countries that are democratic according to how political scientists order democratic countries is going down. The number of countries that are autocratic is going up. And I think the only way, and this is actually related to wealth inequality, if you ask the specialist on autocracies, Timothy Schneider, he will say that if he is looking for indicators of when a country is becoming dangerously close to authoritarianism, he looks at the level of wealth inequality. Well, there you have it. So I do think we have to become really politically engaged. Also, that means I actually think we should talk more about politics at birthday parties, at the Christmas dinner. We should make politics as part of our lives. And that's also why I'm grateful that you are all here today and that you have put this together, because I do think it's important that citizens talk about these things.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robeyns. David, I'll send it over to you in the parish hall to take questions.
Okay, we're going to take questions online in the chat. Jay will read some of those out, and then we have a microphone for anyone who wants to ask a question in the parish hall. Just raise your hand and we'll get you a mic. Feel free, folks.
Hi, Dr. Robeyns. We're getting this via Zoom. Bill Reisner wants to ask, he says, thank you for your work. Says in the U.S. there seems to be a proliferation of class distinctions. Think of the perks that you can buy when traveling on airlines. And it occurs to me that this can be socially destructive because it reduces encounters across class, making it more and more possible for upper classes to be completely insulated from and ignorant of the reality of poverty. Do you agree? Do you see any evidence of pushback against this kind of class segregation?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. It's a very important question, and it is, I totally agree. I mean, I agree that this is a problem. The extent to which this happens in the US, since I'm not living there, I can't really confirm, but we see it everywhere. Also, I did, for the book that I wrote, I interviewed a number of multimillionaires, and including Abigail Disney, and I always ask the people I interviewed just a very general question. I told them, I'm writing this book. What are your thoughts? And she started to talk about the soul. And all the other people I talked to were very, were talking about democracy or taxes. And she said, if you grow up very wealthy and you live in those circles all your life, it corrupts your soul. And I think she was referring really to the process that was in the question that's just been asked. So that basically you no longer know how ordinary people live. And she actually criticizes her own, the family that her grandfather set up for also being part of this, so that the workers at Disney previously were much more part and had a decent living, and now they're really some of them are living in poverty, and that is because this huge gap. And in this respect, it's interesting that there is a professor of ethics at Stanford University called Deborah Zetz, and she's written a paper where she argues for compulsory civic service precisely because of this reason, so that you must at some point in your life, preferably when you're relatively young, engage with other people in who come from all sorts of diverse backgrounds. And on a personal note, when I was a student, I did all the summers I did voluntary work across Europe, also in Northern Africa and Latin America. And I've always said that I learned more in that voluntary work about the world than in the studies I did. So I really do believe that it is very important for the formation of a person to engage with people who are leading very different lives. And if you are in some way privileged, to really seek out the encounters with people who are having much less luck in life.
Ingrid, good afternoon. My name is Jim Winkler. I'm curious, I came in a little bit late, so maybe you address this. How do you address the issue of profit and incentive and the importance of innovation in society and in life and business in terms of solving environmental challenges, writing the most beautiful sonata, just that kind of creativity that's so much a part of humanity, but in the risk-taking dimension of our lives, not that many people are incentivized to take risks, to put capital at risk, start a business, grow it. So how do you find the balance between maintaining that innovation and profit incentive and some of the boundaries that you're talking about in terms of Unitarianism?
Yes, thanks very much. This is great that you're asking this because, first of all, it's an important question, but also I didn't comment on this yet. So I should have said that limitarianism is what philosophers call a regulative ideal. That means we might never reach it. It might not be feasible, but it is still something we have reasons to aspire to. And the reasons why I think it is not feasible is, first of all, because of the current political climate, but also because as long as there are people who need financial incentives in order to put in the extra work, and they are not, they don't want to become, they don't want to become just millionaires and have, say, 10 or 20 or 30 millions, but they think that they should have the possibility to become billionaires, and otherwise they're not willing to take those risks. We have a problem. But of course, this is not, it's not as if it's in our human nature that we must want to become centi-billionaires. You could say, what if we say you can become, say, a millionaire who has 30 or 50 millions if you are hugely successful? Would that be enough? Well, why not? Because with 50 million, I'm guessing you can basically buy everything you need, much more than what you need. And the question about innovation and profit seeking is an interesting one, because the standard theory, and I'm also trained in mainstream economics, so I've studied the standard theory completely, is that if you have the right incentives, and that means you allow for profits, companies will innovate and they will take the risks. However, this is the theory. There are two big there are many disclaimers to make, but two important ones is that we've also seen that profit-seeking and innovation don't always go together. Luke Kemp comments on this when he writes in his book about the transition to electric vehicles, that companies from the fossil fuel industry took all sorts of now I forget the word, but in English. So they took all sorts of patents. They took all sorts of patents on electric vehicles, but not to use them, but to basically block this innovation. So profit-seeking and innovation are not exactly the same thing. That's because companies are profit maximizing, at least I should say not all companies, because I also speak with entrepreneurs who actually are developing a different business model. They want to balance those different concerns and are happy to have lower profits if that means they're doing good on some other dimensions. But also, historically, a very important driver of or agent of innovation was the government. And here the work by the Italian-British professor Mariana Mazzucato is very important, because she showed. Sorry, I need to just take some water. Mariana Mazzucato showed that the decision by the American government to put a person on the moon, to put a man on the moon, led to all sorts of innovations in all sorts of industries. So you can have industrial policy, which is proactive, trying to make innovations, but what you then should then do is to make sure that the benefits of industrial policy, which leads to innovations, is spread over the population, and that it doesn't get into the hands of a few billionaires who will only become richer. And there it is very important to keep a wall between the area of business, where profit-seeking is an important motive, and the area of the government, which should protect the interest and look at the interests of everybody. And of course, if you have if those two merge and the entrepreneurs and the billionaires become part of the government or are very closely intertwined, then I think you get into dangerous terrain, not just for democracy, but also, I guess, you get monopolies, which are not, as we know, monopolies lead to lower welfare for consumers. I hope that addressed at least some of the question.
Thank you. My name is David, and I know your background is not particularly in history or in anthropology, but it seemed like 100 years ago, America used to be a lot more skeptical about our billionaires. It seems like Europe has a healthy skepticism of our billionaires. It seems like in the last 100 years, America has come to worship their billionaires, and I don't know if you see that or not, or if that's the same in Europe.
So the impression that exists in Europe, but the question is whether it's true or whether it's a cliche, is that indeed in the US there's much more culture of what's captured under the American dream. Everybody, if you are given equal formal opportunities, could in principle become very rich. You just have to use the opportunities that you get. It's true that I think in Europe there's much more of a skeptical attitude, but it is mixed, and I'm sure it's also mixed in the US. However, what we do know is that if we look at the history of economic ideas, that around the 1930s, but especially in the 1940s, there was a group of scholars who really developed all those arguments that government is inherently bad and incapable, and that you should keep government as small as possible, and that you should give the market as much space as possible. And that group of scholars came together in 1947 in Switzerland in a village called Mont Pelerin, and they grounded the Mont Pelerin Society, and they have then spread their ideas to think tanks that have really proactively and deliberately spread those pretty radical pro-market ideas. And there is a book written by the Harvard historian of Science, Naomi Oreskes, who basically details, I mean, there are many books, but this is one of them, that details how this was a deliberate strategy. So if I talk about our dominant culture, and if I say that basically we've shifted also from seeing luck as an important factor and that we take individual responsibility so important, there are other shifts. And they have not just come by accident. I mean, of course, something may just evolve because technologies evolve and knowledge increases, but there are also some shifts in our culture that happen because there's a group of people that deliberately spread those ideas. And I think the one that glorifies the billionaires as either geniuses, or the saviors, or all those purely positive terms comes also from a deliberate attempt at just allowing wealth inequality to go unchecked. And I think what is important is to keep reminding that, yes, wealth is very important. It's important for everybody. Half of the population currently has virtually no wealth, and there is a huge concentration of it at the top. And this is not the best of all worlds we could have. I think that is what we should say, without falling into stereotypes that this then must lead us to communism or some such debate stopper.
Dr. Robeyns, thank you for being with us today. My name is Aidan, and limitarianism is obviously about the ceiling. You mentioned a little bit about the welfare state. You talked about it in the Netherlands. I'm wondering what, if any, role the floor plays in the philosophy of limitarianism, because I think the welfare state is this incredible tool that in the US, at least, we have failed to use for, I mean, really since the end of the New Deal order. And I think that's one thing you mentioned, Matthew Desmond's book, Poverty by America. That's one thing that he seems to overlook a little bit in his particular work, is the role that the welfare state can play and has played in other countries to lift up people from the bottom. So I'm wondering just kind of, what role the floor plays in this discussion about the ceiling.
Yes, thanks very much for this question. So, I mean, I, as a political philosopher, I started to write this book. So my background is in political philosophy and in economics. And the people who work on distributive issues in those two fields, they all kind of agree that we should eliminate as much poverty as possible. So I take this as a sort of a given that we want to have as few poor people as possible. But for many of, especially economists, that's all they care about. So that's why I wrote this book about the ceiling. But I take it actually as almost evident that we want people to be lifted above a certain floor. And then the question is, how does the ceiling and the floor, how they relate to each other? And the story that has been told to us, I should say, by economists, theoretically, without empirical proof, over the 80s, 90s, and the beginning of this century was called the trickle-down theory, or there were other names. And the idea was, if you just cut taxes on the richest, it will create much more wealth and it will lift everybody up. That theory has empirically been disproven. It's not true. Of course, it is true that if you were to tax massively and you were to make life of entrepreneurs incredibly hard, it would have negative effects for all sorts of groups. But there are reasons, I think, to have a societal arrangement, so an economic and a social system that makes it possible for everybody to live in decency, not just for humanitarian reasons, for reasons to do with human dignity, but also purely for economic reasons. Because if people are well educated and they are healthy, they are also better workers. So I think the case for something, a certain kind of welfare state, but then the big discussion is what kind of welfare state, can be made both on moral reasons, but also on efficiency reasons. And one important reason actually for something like the welfare state is that if you pool risks, and I'm thinking of the risks of living, I mean, this may sound really strange, but living very long lives, because if we have to save for our pension, but we don't know whether we will become 80 or 90 or even longer, or we live longer, we don't know how much we have to save. So some people will not save enough, other people will save too much, and that means they will not consume enough when they are younger. But also, especially the risks of becoming disabled or the risk of becoming ill, those risks should be what economists call pooled. That means you pool them, and you all pay into a system where if that risks apply to you, you would be taken care of by the community. And that is an efficiency argument for the welfare state. It's not a justice argument. So I do think that we have very good reasons to want some form of welfare state. And I should say, in Europe, many of the welfare states have become thinner. So, for example, if I look at what my country in the Netherlands, what the provisions were for disabled people 20 years ago or now, it's less now than it was 20 years ago.
Well, we're coming up on 11 o'clock, and we have folks that need to get to our worship service. So I'll stop us there, but thank you so much, Dr. Robeyns.
Can we get one more? David's
Can we get
asking.
one more? Well, okay, if it's really fast.
So thank you. My name is Ian, and you talked about the fossil fuel lobby, and I am part of that. But I could tell you that we are not monolithic. The company I work for now has invested $7 billion in solutions for climate change, and our CEO has been very outspoken about the science being very real. So I just suggest that when you make the sort of generalizations about the industry, we're not all the same. And I think that's the same. You know, I was thinking about what Bill Gates is doing and Warren Buffett and giving away their wealth and how much benefit that's creating for society. And what I worry about and would support most of what you're saying, there should be a limit on income, and these billions of dollars should go to the places where it's going to add and address poverty and welfare inequality. But what I worry about with governments putting caps is if that money goes to governments, and right now I would feel very comfortable with those billions of dollars going to Barack Obama and his administration figuring out a way to pass it on. But if it's going to Donald Trump, what happens to that money? And I think that's the challenge of some of what I'm hearing you say, and I'd be curious if you can address that.
Yes, I think I have 30 seconds, right? So first, thanks for the comment about trying not to be monolithic. You're definitely right. And even, I mean, I hope you can get the book from the library and read it, because I do discuss a lot of examples of billionaires that really did fantastic things with their money. And there are, I collaborate with the Patriotic Millionaires, which is an activist group of millionaires and billionaires that really try to protect democracy and have fair taxation. So, and the same about companies. But the things what I've been saying so far are averages for the industry. And I fear that really the fossil fuel industry does, as an aggregate, does bear a lot of responsibility for the delays in the transition that's necessary. Your question about not wanting to go money to certain governments, I totally agree. And this is also why I think, so there's two scenarios possible. One is we believe there's a society we can have without a government, and then we would arrange it differently. I don't think that is feasible given the level of complexity of societies. That means we must make sure that our governments are decent. And that's why I call upon all citizens to become politically active, broadly engaged in order to protect democracies. Of course, this doesn't solve the question right now. I do think there must be a balance between different powers. And what I would say to the wealth holders right now, and they do actually, some of them ask me, what should I do? I think it is actually to provide a countervailing power to those regimes that are not really caring about human life, but that are destroying human life. So we do always have to, we should never work with slogans, but we should always keep thinking what is important. And I I think that is how I also take your comment. That means that yes, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and all the others are playing a very important role, but they should also use it to really make political decisions about strengthening the democracies and protecting human rights and so forth.
Wonderful. Thank you for the question, Ian. Sorry to rush you. Thank you so much again, Dr. Robeyns, for joining us for this hour and illuminating us on your important arguments. And thank you to everyone who joined online or in the parish hall. I do
Thank
want to
you.
plug for reading Ingrid's book. We have a copy of Limitarianism in the parish library, so please check that out. And please join us next week when we talk about uneven opportunity in education. We'll talk about how higher ed used to be an engine for social mobility, but now many scholars are arguing that it's the opposite. It's an engine for reinforcing inequality. So everybody, let's give Ingrid a big round of applause. So thank you, Ingrid, again.
Thank you very much and have a very nice Sunday. Bye-bye.